there's obviously a bit of a challenge in, as kind of Logan said this a little bit before, but a lot of publishing houses are moving towards more, I suppose I'd say, accessible stuff. And in an age where perhaps Christians aren't reading like they used to, and where there's perhaps not the appetite or the stamina for something with a bit more depth, how do you kind of, how does that work into your thinking when it comes to what you publish? Because putting out, something by John Owen or John Flavel, a lot of Christians today would pick that up and put it down straight away again when they saw what they were looking at.
Yeah, I think there's probably multiple.
There wasn't much of a question there. I suppose the question is, does that put you off, or are you kind of committed to this vision and you think we've got to get this good stuff out there because there could be a total change and people will suddenly be craving it again and they're not going to be able to get it anywhere else?
Yeah, I think there's probably multiple layers in the question there and in an answer. It does affect us in our thinking, certainly, that we hear people say, oh, we can't read anything more than a page. If it's anything more than, a tweet length, we can't read. And I think there's an element of truth to that, in the sense that I think we are being conditioned because of things like social media and so on. We're being conditioned to look for the short things. We're being conditioned to look for the pithy quote. We almost live our lives by, the Instagram quote that somebody's posted, or, people posting little sort of images with texts on Facebook or wherever.
Logan does it all the time. He's always posting up quotes from different books.
Yeah, he's feeding that machine. Yeah,
yeah.
Right.
So they're good quotes.
Yeah, they're from banner books.
That's right.
Oh, that's okay then. That's okay then. Yeah, and don't get me wrong. There's a place for these things. I'm not saying there isn't, but I think there is, to some extent, a bit of a conditioning. And we also live in a world, don't we, that wants instant gratification. And I think, again, that plays into the Christian world at times. We don't want any longer to go to a restaurant and to sit for 4 hours having a meal. And we'd rather go to, McDonald's and walk in and out in 5 minutes with your Big Mac. And I think some of that is present in the church too. And I think some of that goes into the realms of reading. So we do think about that. We do realize that, things like, ebooks, audiobooks, these sorts of things are media that we need to take seriously and think about how we respond to these things. But I often say to people, it's not true to say that people don't read. That isn't true. And if you look back in recent years, there have been some phenomenal things taking place in the world of books. Harry Potter being an example. Millions of people read Harry Potter. And it's not a small book. Well, none of them are small books because there's more than one, isn't there? So, you've got this series of books. And if you put that series of books onto your bookshelf, it takes up quite a bit of real estate. They're not small books. So people do read. And I think the key to understanding that is asking the question, why was it that when J.K. Rowling said there's a new Harry Potter book coming out, and the likes of here, W.H. Smith and other bookstores on the high street said, oh, we're going to release that on, whatever the date, January the 21st or whatever. Why was it you had people queuing up on the pavement outside before the store was even open to get that book? And I think the answer to that is desire. That's what it was all about. It was desire. They wanted that next book. And I think there's a certain, there's a certain parallel in terms of reading for Christians. It's desire. And I think, we can go along in our Christian lives. We can just sort of muddle along, no real desire to grow. And sometimes that's because we're not being challenged. But I think where there is increasing desire, then what we tend to see is people then will read more, because reading is one of the ways in which people can grow as Christians. And I think where you have that desire, people gradually are more and more willing to tackle harder things, shall we say. And sometimes it's needing a little bit of help and advice as to how to tackle some of those things. So, if you're faced with a big book, how do you attack the big book? If you're faced with something where the language perhaps is a little bit more difficult than what you're used to, how do you deal with that? If all you've been used to reading in your life is novels, then how do you read a Christian book, which is not a novel? So how do you go about reading? Sometimes that is something we have to help people with, as they, realize that actually there are other genres of literature than just a novel. It is a challenge. I think ministers have a particular responsibility, because I think ministers can help their congregations and can encourage their congregations, both in reading in general, but also in what to read. One of the things that is very noticeable to me is that when a minister stands up in front of his congregation and says, this book is a really helpful book, and it would be great if you guys could get this and read it, people take notice. Ministers of churches are in very trusted positions, and people do listen, and people do take that advice. And I think a minister who is careful with what they recommend as well, and maybe even reading groups and so on within churches can help in this regard, encouraging people to read. I think that is actually a key ministry that somebody can have within their church. We had a gentleman who was ministering in Glasgow some years ago who contacted me, and he said, would it be possible for me to get some books from you? I'd like to recommend a book. I'm thinking of doing sort of a monthly book recommendation for our congregation. I said, yeah, certainly. And I met him halfway across the M8 between Edinburgh and Glasgow in a service station to hand over a box of books to him. And I said, how many do you want? He said, well, give me 50. And it was a sizable congregation he had. So I gave him 50, and he rang me the following, after the weekend, the following week, and said, I think you better send me another 50, because he'd recommended the book and he'd had a lot of people wanting the book. And after that, he was doing a monthly book, and I would say typically it was in the order of 75 to 100 copies of the book that he was distributing amongst his people every month. And I've no doubt that will have impacted his people, no doubt at all.
For busy mums who are running around with toddlers, and for men who are working 40, 50 hours a week, how do you weave reading into a busy life?
Yeah, that's a really good question, I think. I think it's a challenge. I don't think we can avoid saying that. It is a challenge. If people are busy, reading is something that demands your attention. I don't think it's not something you can do while you do something else. It's interesting, actually, if you look at what's some of the research and statistics that have come out from the publishing world in terms of things like audiobooks. It fascinates me to see the number of people who state that an audiobook is something they listen to while they do something else. Now, that might be while they're doing the ironing, and perhaps that's okay. But actually, what staggered me was the number of people who confessed to listening to audiobooks while they're at work. I don't see how you can do that. How can you do two things and concentrate on them? I can understand if you're doing the ironing, perhaps you can do the ironing in fairly automatic mode, and therefore it's a time when you can listen to something and benefit from listening to it. But reading, I don't think, is like that. You can't expect to read and look after your children at the same time. You can't expect to read and be doing your 50-hour-a-week job at the same time. So it has to be a dedicated pursuit. And so that means having to find time. So yeah, I don't think we can avoid the fact that if you have very busy people and you have very busy lives, it can be difficult to find the time to read. But that's the key, isn't it? Find the time to read. I think you have to be intentional about it. So you have to say, well, whatever period it is in the day that is that period of time that you can dedicate to this, I will set that time aside. So maybe, you know, a guy who's really busy with his work comes home really tired in the evening. Well, maybe that's getting up half an hour earlier every day and dedicating half an hour a day to reading. And again, that's something that's worth emphasizing. It doesn't have to be 3 hours. You don't have to read for 3 hours to gain the benefit. And in fact, depending on what you're reading, sometimes, you know, reading for 15 minutes and then thinking about what you've read is better than reading for 2 hours. So I think the point is you have to be intentional about it. And the same with, you know, with a mum who's maybe at home with kids and so on. You have to be intentional. You have to find that period in the day that you do have a little bit of peace and quiet. But that really is the only thing you could say. You have to be intentional about it. You have to set aside that period of time. And it might be 15 minutes, it might be half an hour, but you have to find that time within your schedule and set that aside for reading.
I think one thing I just would be finding something really deep, like John Owen, for example. I got The Glory of Christ of John Owen. And, you know, he's so thick and dense that not thick in a bad way, but, you know, thick in a good way. It's so heavy and dense that I would just read one paragraph and then I'd just sit it down. And at the time I was working, so I'd do some stuff and then come back and read one paragraph and then go back to my work again. And because that's all you need is one of his paragraphs. You just got to chew on it and chew on it. And so I think for a lot of busy people, especially stay-at-home mums and stuff like that, it's something you can do. Leave it sitting on your mantelpiece, pick it up, read a paragraph, and then carry on and look after the kids.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, it depends on the type of thing you're reading, but the right sort of thing, yeah, you can do that. So you can, as you say, read a bit and then meditate on it and think about what you've read and then come back to it again a bit later in the day and read the next bit and so on. Absolutely, yeah. And sometimes that's necessary. I mean, just going back to what I was saying earlier about desire, for me, I think the thing that perhaps really switched me onto Owen was having problems in a church that we were in. And there were some particular issues, and Owen had some really good things on those particular issues. And I read Owen in a way I'd never read him before, because all of a sudden, this was a really live issue to me. And all of a sudden, I had desire to work through this issue. And here was a man who could help me. And yeah, sure, it was deep stuff. It was, you know, for want of a better way of putting it, it was heavy stuff. But all of a sudden, that desire was there. And that's what really switched me on, in a sense, to Owen. And after that, I found it far easier to read, actually. And, you know, in a sense, that initial desire because of one particular thing then led on to more. Yeah.
John Owen is, he might not be thick, but he makes me feel thick sometimes when I try and read some of his stuff. It's wonderful when you find an author like that. There've been a handful that not only do they have answers to the questions that you have, but they ask questions I would never have thought to ask. Like, I remember reading Pink for the first time and just being like, it's a brilliant question. How did he, it was on Doctrine of Sanctification. I just thought, this brilliant question. I just never would have even thought of it. And yet he grabs it, and not only thinks of it, answers it. So we want to keep this focused on Banner of Truth in particular. And we'll go in a slightly different direction. And John, my next question for you, and I'm going to put this to Logan and to myself as well, because it's an exciting question. What are your top 10 recommendations of Banner of Truth books? If you can't do 10, give us 5. If you can't do 5, give us 3. But Logan, I'm coming to you for 2, and then I'm going to give 2 as well, because I tried to do 1, but I couldn't do just 1. So John, you lead us off, and then we'll just repeat what you say afterwards.
Okay, well, yeah, now this is a problem, okay? This is a serious problem.
And you're not allowed to say, though, you're not allowed to say that book. Is it called You Should Read, where it just like it lists all of the different cool banner books that you can get? That one doesn't count because I'm using that one.
Okay. Yeah, well, it's a real problem because there's more than 10. And again, in a sense, it comes back to other things too. So, we've talked about, why do people read? Why should people read and so on? And I mentioned, desire and so on. And I think one of the things that we have to remember is that just because we think a book has, or we have been heavily impacted by a book, doesn't necessarily mean to say that somebody else will be. And I think we have to remember that, different people are at different stages in their Christian lives. And yeah, sure, there are some books that everybody says, yeah, these are classic books. Everybody should read these and you will benefit to some degree from them. But, I've had the experience myself where I've had somebody tell me, this is just such a wonderful book. It really impacted me. You should read this. And I've gone and read it. I'm like, yeah, really? It's not that great. And I've had the opposite experience where I said to somebody, this is a fantastic book, and they've read it and gone, oh, really? So I think you just have to bear that in mind that, any book that somebody recommends, well, when did they read it? Were they going through a particular experience in their Christian lives at that time, and therefore that book particularly spoke to that? Or so I think it makes it difficult, therefore, to say, here's my top 10 books. But let's try something. So I suppose in terms of, if we talk Puritans, my personal favourite would probably be John Flavel. Any of your listeners, watchers who subscribe to the magazine will know that I wrote a little article on the Mystery of Providence a few months ago. That's one of my favourite books. You said, Geoff, about, you read these books and you're like, how on earth did they think of that question? And I think that's one of the things with reading Puritan works. They're exhaustive in many ways in the way they treat things. And you've got this classic, part 1, subheading 1 of part 1, subheading 1 of subheading 1 of part 1, and it goes on and on and on. Look at things like Precious Remedies from Satan's Devices. I mean, seriously, exactly, yeah. You have a look through that book, and it's exhaustive in the way it treats the subject. So, and the Puritans are like that. You read things like Mystery of Providence, and to me, it opened my eyes to all sorts of things, really, in the way that God works in the world. So that will, anything by Flavel, Mystery of Providence in particular, would be one of my sort of top 10. There would be other Puritan paperbacks as well. Some people turn their noses up at some of our Puritan paperbacks that we've done at Owen because they're abridgments. But what I would say is they're a good entry point into Owen, and sometimes reading the abridgment helps you get the structure of the subject before you then go into Owen proper. So I think some of the Owen abridgments that we do, I would encourage people to read those. If you never get into Owen properly, well, at least you'll get the core of the message from those abridgments. So they would be in my, if I'm allowed to quote, because there's quite a few of those, if I'm allowed to lump those together as one of my 10, that would be another one. If you think about biographies,
how many are there, John? Just on paperbacks, because that would be a lovely place to start for somebody if they were keen to get into Puritan stuff. Like that's a great entry point, and there's a nice collection to build up. Or usually you do a Christmas special and get the lot for. Yeah,
there's at any point in time it won't be quite this number because things, we come in and out of print with certain things or out of stock with things. If everything's in stock, we've got 60 Puritan paperbacks. I think it might actually be 61 now. So there's plenty there to get your teeth into if you're looking at trying to get into sort of Puritan works. Again, if you are, if you're a preacher, then there are things like The Art of Prophesying, which is a Puritan paperback, which is just wonderful stuff, very helpful. So there's a lot in the Puritan paperback series, covers subjects, covers sort of scripture, lots of different things. So if you want something on prayer, Bunyan on prayer, you can't go wrong with Bunyan on prayer. It's just really, really good. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff in the Puritan paperbacks. Yeah, thinking biographies, well, perhaps the classic missionary biography maybe would be John Peyton. So that would be probably in my top 10. Alongside that, and again, for different people, different reasons, I think the Lloyd Jones biographies are very important books. And again, I think I've placed those in the top 10. If people can't handle 2 volumes, which stretch to a lot of pages, there is the condensed single volume one. You really need to read the 2 volumes, but hey, if you can't quite manage that, go with the single volume. So those 2 biographies, I would say, important books. Another in my top 10 would be History of the Work of Redemption by Jonathan Edwards. That's a book that I remember reading that, and the first time I read it, it just kind of blew my mind. I was just like, whoa, this is unbelievable stuff. Partly because when you read it, you realize this is a guy who's got such an incredible grasp of scripture. And it's not a man who's got an amazing grasp of the Gospel of John or of, the book of Romans or of Genesis. This is a man who's got a grasp of Genesis to Revelation, and he sees how it fits together. And he's helping me to see how it all fits together. And as he traces through, the basic theme of the book, really, I suppose, is tracing through, well, what it says, the title, The History of Redemption. So he's kind of tracing through the Old Testament, the way in which the line of Christ was preserved, for instance, right through into then Christ coming and then Christ dying and so on, and then on into the sort of early church. And, one of the things that struck me, I think, when I read that book was there's a bit in it where he talks about, all through the history of redemption, the devil has been trying to prevent this happening. And you get to the crucifixion, and here's the point where the devil finally thinks he's achieved his objective. Christ is being killed on the cross. And what he doesn't understand is that whilst that might be him achieving his objective, actually, that is God achieving his objective. And that is the ultimate defeat for Satan. And he brings that out in a very powerful way. So that would be one of my top 10 books, I think. History of the Work of Redemption. Edwards as an author, very much somebody you should be reading. Again, if you want another Edwards title, Heaven, a World of Love. We actually do a little paperback edition of that in the Pocket Puritans that we do. That's just kind of a mind-blowing book for me. It's hard to think of heaven sometimes, I think. Difficult to imagine. We always want, don't we? We want to know things. And it's difficult to imagine heaven, I think. But Edwards on Heaven, great little booklet, great little book. So again, I would put that up there in my choice. Other things, Holiness by Ryle, kind of a must read for everybody. That's one of those books that I think you can recommend to anybody and they should get something from it. There are different versions of Holiness out there. I would recommend you get, of course I'm going to say this, but I'd recommend you get the Banner book. And one of the reasons for that is that it is what we would think of as the full version of Ryle's Holiness. There were some earlier editions that had part of it in, but our edition has the sort of full thing. Again, when you read that, you need to think. Most of Ryle's books were not written as books. So they were originally, each chapter would have been a tract. He was a big tract writer. Tracts in his day were not quite maybe what we think of today. There might be 100 pages. We tend to think of a tract as a little leaflet, don't we? So each chapter is very standalone in a lot of writings of Ryle. And that is true in holiness. It's very much standalone chapters. But it's interesting to me where he starts. His first chapter is on sin. Is that where we would start thinking about holiness? I'm not sure it is. And if I sat down to write a book on holiness, would I start off with my first chapter as a chapter on sin? I don't know. But it's the right place to start. And that I think that's a very powerful book. I'm losing track of how many I've said now. So what else?
I think you've said about 3.
Sorry. Okay, I'm feeling chastised now. Move on quickly, I think that means. Promise of the Future. Big volume, but don't be put off. Cornelius Venema. The coverage in that volume is huge. And he covers lots of things, everything from sort of angels, he deals with heaven, he deals with sort of post millennial, amillennial views, all that kind of thing. The coverage is massive, very accessible book, very, I think, well written, because it's a subject that often is written about from very entrenched positions and sometimes in a fairly sort of rabid way. I remember one of the reviews we had of that book was published, that the guy basically talked about what was in there, and at the very end, he put, "This is a great book." He said, "Of course, I don't agree with him, but he treats my position fairly." And I think that's one of the important things in that book. He treats things fairly. You may agree or disagree with him, but I don't think you could ever accuse him of being unfair in the way he treats you, because he works from scripture all the time. He's always referencing back to scripture. Great book, very well worth reading. I think a modern day author who, in a sense, you almost can't go wrong with would be Sinclair Ferguson. A couple of his books that he's done in recent years, From the Mouth of God, very helpful little book. I think any Christian who's interested and serious about Bible study should read that book. It's just a very helpful book. His recent books, Devoted to God, Devoted to God's Church, again, helpful, I think, challenging. Devoted to God's Church particularly, and maybe particularly because of the situation we've been in the last couple of years with COVID, I think that has challenged some of our views of church. I think it continues actually to challenge some of our views of church. So that little book, it's not a particularly big book, but Devoted to God's Church, again, I would say is a very helpful book. And I would put in my sort of top 10 list.
Yeah.
Other things, we've talked about Calvin's Institutes. I think any minister, particularly who hasn't read Calvin's Institutes, you need to read Calvin's Institutes. We do a particular edition of the Institutes, which is perhaps a little bit more accessible in some regards than some editions of the Institutes because of the date on it. In a sense, it's a condensed edition. So that can be very helpful. So the Institutes, but also on Calvin, read his sermons. I know, talking to Logan earlier, mentioning that you've been reading Calvin's sermons on Galatians and benefiting from those. My personal favorite is Ephesians, but read his sermons, tremendously helpful. If you have people who are familiar with Calvin's commentaries, don't think the sermons are going to be the same, because they're not. The sermons are quite different. There's a life and a liveliness to them, which at times you can almost hear him standing there preaching. So read his sermons. Calvin, any of Calvin's sermons. What else? Well, I'm a big fan of Ryle, so I've mentioned Holiness already, but anything else by Ryle. If you're looking for something that's perhaps something you could read as a devotional, then pick up his expository thoughts. They can work you through the Gospels. By the time you get Matthew and Mark are shorter than the Luke and John, and the reason for that is that when you get into Luke and particularly into John, you get an awful lot more sort of what you might think of as more of commentary type comments rather than an expository thought. And if you pick the books up and have a look at them, you'll understand what I mean by that difference. But, you know, if you just limited yourself, for instance, to reading the text and then reading the expository thought, tremendously helpful. And you can work through the Gospels, really good for sort of personal devotional reading.
Very accessible.
Yeah. I mean, Ryle is, you know, he writes in a way that sometimes you think this guy must be writing today. Yeah. He is accessible. He's on point. You know, he sees the issues. I mean, yeah, he just writes very well. He wrote, there's one of his tracts that he wrote, which I think was originally titled How Readest Thou? And it's all about reading the Bible. And, you know, it's a great piece. It's why we should read the Bible in a sense. But there's a little bit, so I happen to have it here. He says, by reading that book, that's the Bible, by reading the Bible, we may learn what to believe, what to be and what to do, how to live with comfort, how to die in peace. Happy is that man who possesses a Bible, happier still he who reads it. Happiest of all is he who not only reads it, but obeys it and makes it the rule of his faith and practice. I mean, that's fantastic, isn't it? And actually, it's an important thing, because sometimes people say to me, why do we even need books? And why are you telling us to read books? What's the most important book to read? Well, actually, you know, in the context of a top 10 things to read, a book that we don't publish that is absolutely number one is the Bible, isn't it? Yeah. You know, we should be reading the Bible above everything else. That's what we have to read. But then books help us to understand the scriptures. Books help us to build up in the faith. And that's an injunction we get all over the New Testament, isn't it? From whether it be Peter into 2 Peter, whether it be Paul in various different places. You know, even I think a lot of us are familiar with the last verse or two of Jude. It's often used at the close of services, but again, read back up a little bit earlier in Jude, and he talks in there about contending for the faith and so on. And to be able to do that, we need help, and that's why books are important alongside the Bible. But you know, in any conversation about reading, we must never not talk about reading the scriptures. That's so important.
That's good.